Hello everyone, and welcome. So this is a seminar from the Anna Freud Centre's Early Years in Mind Learning Network. Please can I ask if any of you are tweeting about the event today, if you hashtag Early Years in Mind, and we'll be doing the same from our account. So have a look at what we share. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Camila Rosen, and I'm head of the Early Years programme here at the Anna Freud Centre. And I'm a psychologist by background, specialising in early years, but I've also worked in childcare myself and in children's centre settings across my career. At the moment, my main interaction with childcare is through nurseries, as I have a little 4-year-old myself. Before I introduce our two fabulous speakers, I'd like to let you know a little bit more about Early Years in Mind Network, if you haven't heard of it before, and what the network might be able to offer you or your setting. So if we go on to the next slide, we currently have 13,000 members. We launched last June, so it's been just incredible to get that far so quickly. Early Years in Mind is our kind of free online resource and learning network for people who work with early years aged children. It's aimed at early years staff across the board. This might be nursery staff or childminders, health visitors, stay and play workers, or others of you that are involved in the field. Most of our content will offer benefits to all staff who work with young children, to be honest, but some content might be aimed at specific settings. We always try and be easy to read and accessible and simple, and provide kind of tools and guidance on the best way to support the mental health and well-being of the babies, young children and their families who are in your care. We also aim to offer to explore in an easy way what attachment informed practice is, and that's what we're all about at the Anna Freud Centre, and to provide tips on how early years workers can use it in their work. So please check out our Early Years in Mind website. Some examples are what you can see on the screen here. This is our A to Z of common difficulties. We have a new one that came up this week on sibling rivalry that went out in our last newsletter. And all of these have been designed by the kind of the difficulties or the challenges that you've told us that you're grappling with in your settings and you want more support with. If you go on to the next slide, we also have a whole range of other early years resources, including a specialist area for kind of working through the pandemic. So perhaps doing reviews with parents or children digitally, supporting children that have experienced difficulties in pandemic or social distancing. There's a whole range on there, so I really encourage people to have a bit of an explore. And we're always kind of updating and developing what we're doing, so we've got some interesting additions on the horizon, and we've got a new section that we're hoping to launch later in the year on working with vulnerable families and how to support, I guess, that a relationship between the babies in your care and their parents. We've got some e-learning modules that we're bringing out on infant mental health, and a section on the website that will offer guidance on supporting staff wellbeing in early years settings. Sign up to the network is completely free, and members who sign up to the network receive our e-newsletter, which kind of keeps them up to date of the latest things going on, including lots of events like this one. So next slide. The reason for this webinar is at the end of last year, we sent out a survey to early years workers, and over 900 of you replied. And this really formed the basis of this report, Their Challenges Are Our Challenges, which we released a few months ago. And nearly half of those who responded said that they'd worked with children who had experienced the bereavement of either a parent or sibling. And over half also said that they hadn't received any additional training alongside their standard training that related to early years mental health. And that is why we decided to run this event. And on the next slide, and to support the event, and as a kind of consequence of that report, we also worked to develop this fabulous new digital booklet, which offers more guidance on this topic. So please, again, if you sign up to the network and have a look at our web pages, you can access it on the early years resources link, or it should be appearing now in the chat as well. So this webinar is a second of a series of 3 that we've arranged as a response to the results of our survey. And if you go to the next slide, our previous event was on managing challenging behaviour in early years settings. And I was told this morning by our digital manager that we've had 5,000 people view this after the seminar. So it's clearly touching on something that feels really helpful. So I hope you check it out too. Our next webinar in the series, responding to what you said you wanted help with in the report, is supporting children in early years settings who have experienced trauma or abuse. And that's on the 24th of June. Free to attend, and I think you should also be getting the link in the chat if you want to book on. So next slide. So another thing I just wanted to promote is our upcoming early years conference. So this is our annual conference that we do once a year. We've got international speakers coming from all around the world, including Ed Tronick, who's the professor who kind of came up with the still face experiment, if you remember that from your training, that really illustrated how important relational kind of work with young babies is. And the theme of the conference this year is around, I guess, shining a light over some of the family members and community members that might be involved in raising children, whether that's grandparents, other kinds of co-parents, same-sex couples, adoptive parents, special guardians, a whole range of different family and community forms. And it's on the 9th of June, an Infant Mental Health Awareness Week. And we've got a special price for Early Years in Mind network members of £99, which is 35% off. So if you are an Early Years in Mind network member, then please do sign up and come along, because it'd be great to see you there. Do you want to go on to the next slide? And that's the link for joining the network. Okay, so now we'll start the focus of today's session, which is on bereavement. We recognise that this can be an understandably very upsetting and distressing topic that will likely have touched all of us in one way or another. We encourage all of you to look after yourselves in this talk, take breaks if you need to, switch off your screen if it gets upsetting. Just look after yourselves. We also recognise that culture and tradition play a big role in how all of us make sense of and respond to grief. And this is picked up in the talks. We're all different, and our wonderful speakers will try to pull out their experiences and thoughts that we hope will speak to lots of families and to lots of you. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Beck Ferrari, who will be talking about how early years staff can support bereaved children and help them make sense of their grief and emotions. Beck is a child bereavement specialist and cognitive behavioural therapist who's worked as both a teacher and a SENCO. And Beck has run a child bereavement service in Kent for a number of years, where she's developed a range of bereavement resources and training designed specifically for early years settings. So we feel really, really lucky that Beck has agreed to talk today, and I really hope you enjoy her. So over to you, Beck.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It always really excites me when people want to talk about grieving young children. So I'm really excited to be here today. I'm just going to go to my share screen so that I can share some of my thoughts with you. So as well as working as a child bereavement specialist, I work at the UK Trauma Council, which is one of the Anna Freud projects. And there we've been developing resources around traumatic bereavement. But today, mainly, I'm going to be talking about my independent work with children of all ages, but specifically focusing on very young children. And I've kind of put this quote in here because I think this is really helpful, particularly for this area. If something is unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. And I think that really speaks to today. It can be so hard to talk about things that are so painful with young children in mind, and that we hope that today feels manageable for you, and that we hope that we're able to make things manageable for the children that you look after and care for and work with in your various settings and roles. So today, we're not really answering the question, do young children grieve, but how do they grieve? And as Camilla just mentioned about being mindful of the child's developmental stage, their family culture, their beliefs, will really help us make sense of that. We know that about 41,000 children each year experience the death of a parent. We don't have any statistics on how young some of those children are, but I would say from 41,000, some of those will be very young children. We also know that very young children are more likely to experience the death of a sibling, particularly through miscarriage or stillbirth, which is something that Claudia will talk to. And we know that even as babies and infants, very young children will respond to the loss of an attachment, because somebody that they're used to being close to, that they're used to caring for them, is no longer there. And even if they don't understand that, they'll definitely have that sense of loss. And they'll also respond to the responses of those that are grieving around them. So even if they don't understand what's happened, they're very likely to pick up on the emotional state of the people that are now caregiving for them. If they've lost a parent, then obviously they're going to have that loss of somebody who they were forming a bond with. If they've lost a sibling, then they might be wondering where that person, that little face that's been peeping over the side of their cot, or if they get older, that's been their little playmate, might be. So they'll definitely experience the loss of an attachment, and definitely pick up on the responses of those that are grieving around them. But without information, a child's understanding is limited to just a sense of loss, that they'll know that something has happened, but they won't necessarily understand what that thing is. So they may not know that this has happened and it's permanent, and they may not understand that it's irreversible, and they probably won't get that it's not their fault. And children, as they're making sense of things, might be particularly prone to magical thinking and believing that things that have happened are their fault. And so, as well as their sadness and the distress of the loss and wondering what's happened, they might also be feeling very frightened, confused, angry, or fundamentally unsafe, as they don't understand what's happened to the world around them and why it's so changed so drastically. So really, this is helping us hopefully give a rationale for why it's really important to help children make sense of death. So I'm going to get you just to have a think while I talk through this about how do young children make sense of death. So thinking with that child in the middle there, what will they make sense of immediately in their kind of environment at home with their caregivers? What will they learn about death from that? Will there be any conversation? Will they have experienced the death of a pet? Will they have found a dead creature in the garden once before? Will they have learned anything? Will there have been other bereavements in the family that have been mentioned? Then we think about preschool. Has anything happened there? In preschool, really good talking about life and services, and we might do work around people that help us, and paramedics and nurses and doctors. Do we actually mention that word about when somebody has died, I wonder? And then of course we do the life cycle of a caterpillar. The caterpillar's moving around, then it forms its chrysalis, and then it obviously turns into a butterfly. And then we go back to that life cycle, but actually somewhere in there, that caterpillar's died. I wonder whether we're mentioning that. And then we think about the wider community. What do children learn from that? Right now, death has been more explicit in the media than ever before, hasn't it? It's been the thing that everybody's been talking about. And even young children of preschool age will probably have picked up on this idea that we're talking about the number of people that have died each day. And we're talking about a virus that's contagious that we have to keep safe from. So actually children might have learned something quite different about death. And then of course, when we think about different cultures as well, in some cultures, death is maybe more visible than others. There may be children may be much more involved with the death of a relative, and other cultures, they're kept further apart from that. So I was being mindful about what's this child made sense of about death, and how might that help them or hinder them in the grief that they're now experiencing. And then what do they know about this death that's happened, not just any death, the concept of death? What do they know? And I think these are kind of 4 really helpful questions for us to ask ourselves and ask as a team that's working around a child, so that we can begin to develop our intervention and our support in relation to that. So that first one is, what information has the child been given about the death? Because it's quite likely the information they've got may not be as much as you've got. And then you're working with, I know something that this child doesn't know. It may even be that the death has been reported to you, but nobody's actually told the child yet. And that happens quite often with young children, until families are ready to tell the child that you've got information. So you're holding on to something and possibly having your own emotional response to it, but not knowing or not necessarily knowing what the child knows. So for us to position ourselves, so we find out what information the child has got, and then what language is being used. Families might typically want to say that somebody's gone to sleep or somebody's been lost. And those terms tend not to be very helpful. If we think about someone being lost, well, let's go and find them. And if we use a phrasing around sleep, then we can make children quite frightened of sleep. And actually death is fundamentally different to sleep. When we're asleep, we're absolutely still alive. Our heart's still beating and we're breathing. So we want to kind of really distance the concept of death from sleep. And there are lots of other phrases that we use that may or may not be helpful. And it's worth asking the family what they've used, and maybe then working out with them, what can we use? Because the only word that actually means died is died, that somebody has died, somebody is dead. And that can sound like a really big word to start using with young children, but it's the only word that means what it is. And therefore we probably need to be brave and use that word if we're going to help children make sense of what's happened. Then the next thing is, what questions do they have? Because really we want to position ourselves as people that can help answer those questions and support them to understand that information, rather than coming in with lots of other information. It's a good rule of thumb that if that's the question they're asking, that's probably the information that they're cognitively ready to take on board. And then kind of around all of this, what do the family believe? And whether that's part of a faith that they have, or just a belief system they've developed about what might happen after somebody died. Because we'll want to be alongside and supporting that family with whatever that belief system is, and helping that child make sense of it. So really thinking about, what does the child know about this death? I sometimes think about this in terms of like a jigsaw puzzle, and that we're working towards the child knowing all these parts. They may not get to know them all straight away, and I'm not saying on day one, if something very sad has happened, we're going to tell the child all of this, but we're certainly working towards building this comprehensive picture for them. And where there are pieces missing, we know that young children are inclined to fill in the gaps themselves. They'll use their current knowledge and their current experiences to try and make sense of things. So actually it's really important, as when children are cognitively able, to be able to get them to think about who has died and when did they die. I think the where did they die is really helpful. Some children grow up and they didn't know where it was, and then when they find out, they can really revisit their grief in a very powerful way, because they didn't know it had happened at grandma's house, or it happened at the road crossing on the corner by their school. Sometimes we want to protect children from that, but actually we're withholding information that helps them put that jigsaw together. Why did they die? Now, of course, for young children, they're probably not going to be ready for lots of detail, but they might need to know why that person died, whether it was an illness or an accident. And even if we need to tell them that they made themselves die, that they can understand that this was a death by suicide. Sadly, lots of young children are bereaved by suicide. And in my experience, when we don't give them that information, alongside them with the support and the consent of the family, that can be really hard for them to make sense of as they get older and find out it was what they thought was true is now not at all true, because then they're left not only having to learn something new and revisit their grief, but maybe potentially not feeling that the adults around them have trusted them with information, and that there hasn't been a real sense of honesty around that. And then the last part of the jigsaw at this stage for young children is what happened next. Was there a funeral? Was that person buried? Was that person cremated? And those concepts, we can think, oh my goodness, they're way too big to explain to young children. But actually children will want to know what happened next. And if we don't offer that information, I worked with a little boy who thought that he mirrored what had happened in EastEnders, because he'd seen that on the television, and he thought that what had happened there, which was part of a very difficult storyline, must have been what happened to his dad, because nobody had told him anything different. And when it was told what happened, that there was a coffin and a funeral, and there's a special place we can go to put flowers, actually that reduced his anxiety around the death, because he knew what it was and wasn't left imagining all sorts of things. So we're looking at putting that jigsaw together when we're really thinking about giving them enough information, giving that child enough information to answer their question, giving them enough detail in line with their developmental stage. So using words that they might understand, and not too much, but in line. And then very much being aware that we will need to revisit this information and update it as they mature, that we'll need to revisit that whole jigsaw, because they might start asking a few more questions about what did all this mean and where exactly did it happen and how exactly and why exactly. But we can start the process with children at least understanding the fundamentals about what's happened as they're grieving for somebody important in their life. So I'm just going to stop for a minute and get us to think about, well, so how do we explain dead to a young child? How do we, what do we use? Because it's very difficult. So many other topics and concepts that we introduce in kind of early years will bring, won't we, a thing, and we'll demonstrate and we'll show, and children will learn with concrete objects and by trying things out and experimenting and play. And this somehow is quite different. I'm going to talk you through some of the things that I think can be quite helpful, and then you can kind of work out for the children we're working with, it might work like this. I think there are concrete things we can help children understand that can be really helpful, and that's that the heart has stopped. And we can test that by getting everyone to help put their hands on their chest and feel their own heartbeat, and help them understand that when we've died, our heart stops working and our whole body doesn't work anymore. Then the next really important thing is for children to understand it's irreversible and that they can't come back to life, that when something or someone has died, we can't bring it back to life anymore. And that can feel like a really hard thing, but actually it's much harder to hold on to the hope that you think you're going to see that loved one again and then find that it's not true. So actually helping them see that that person can't come back to life. The love can carry on, and that can be an important way of us supporting the child, that the love can carry on, but actually the body doesn't work and they can't come back to life. And then for me, the next most important thing is to help children understand that nothing hurts anymore. So they don't need to be worried if they've been told about a coffin or a funeral or cremation or ashes. Nothing can hurt because the body doesn't work. I've added two other things on there, which I think where children are ready for cognitively, it can be really helpful to talk about breathing, that you can't breathe once you've died, that your lungs don't work and you don't need any air anymore, and you can't see or hear. And we've got children who are really wanting to build a picture of what that might mean. And then along with that, that they won't need food and drink and warmth and all those things that we link with looking after living things. I often use bugs to demonstrate this. I've got my bug pot here, but I haven't put one in there. But I've got a little bug pot with all the little holes in the top to allow some air in. And if I'm working with a child directly, I'll go into my garden first and find a ladybird or a earwig or something and pop it in my pot with some leaves and some soil and things. And then we'll have a look at that living thing. We'll put it onto a plate and we'll talk about its heart's working and it's running around, it's moving. Oh, let's be careful, let's look after it. And we talk about the holes in the lid, that it needs to have some air so it can breathe. And we do lots of talking about what it needs, and then we'll put it back later and it will need some special food. I wonder what it eats, should we find out? So we do a lot to make sure that child understands living. And then I introduce my second pot, which has got no holes in the lid, it's just a standard Tupperware pot. And in here I've got a dead bee, which is one I just found on the pavement. I'm sure my own children have got used to me collecting when I find a dead small insect. Now I found with even children as young as 2 and even before 2, when you show them an insect that has died, they often use that word, dead. There's something about it that they recognise. And I say, how do you know that it's died? If they're a little bit older. And they say, it can't move. So we shake it on a paper plate or something, but they know that it can't make itself move, that its body's not working. And then we can talk about that its heart has stopped working and that it can't come back to life. Even if we're really good and tidy our bedrooms, it can't come back to life. Even if we have a special party and we really, even if we wish and we hope and we pray, it still can't come back to life. We're also able to say that it doesn't need holes because it can't breathe anymore, and it doesn't need any food or drink or warmth, and nothing can hurt it. We will be gentle with this dead bug, but actually nothing can hurt it. And those kind of conversations can help children begin to develop an understanding of what dead means, that they can then translate to their own special person and their grief, but not in a way that we're having to talk about their special person particularly right at this stage. Some kind of thoughts around this. I think our role is to be the translator and not the informer. It's very rare that you'll ever be asked to give information. about a death, but you may well be the person that they come back to and you help translate and make sense of that information, which is a core part of what you do in early years, isn't it? You help a child make sense of the world, you help them understand it, you break it down into manageable chunks, you find ways of explaining it. But you're unlikely to be the person who says what's happened, but you may be the person who helps them revisit it. And you may be really well placed to do that, because it may be that the adults around them at home are really struggling to have these open conversations. For me, this conversation about understanding is also a process rather than an event. It's unlikely to be a one-off conversation. We know if we're preparing a child to leave preschool and move into reception, or preparing them because they've got a new baby joining the family, or we're preparing them to move home, we don't just say it once and then say, right, we've told them, let's get on with it. It'll be something that they keep bringing up, that we might drop into conversation, and we'll help them make sense of. And we'll do that by using honest, clear, unambiguous language that says what it is. So using those words that I've already talked about. And then we'll think about that child's communication style and work out how do we normally help that child understand something? Do we usually use photos? Do we usually use some pictures and some symbols? And is there anything we could bring to our discussion of what's happened to help them make sense of that and to revisit it? And all throughout that, we'll be really mindful of the family's values and their beliefs and their history and what they're living through at the moment, in the way that we make sense of that, kind of in line with the parents as much as they can cope with. They might say, can you talk about it, because I'm not able to very much, and we can help them see how that we can talk about it and have some of those conversations. For me, I've learned through lots of contact with bereaved young children, never to assume that the child does understand, but equally never to assume that they don't understand. Sometimes we think a child's made sense of something they've been told, but actually we later find that that really wasn't the case. And then equally, we think a child doesn't understand, and we find that they're holding on to lots of information, that they are much, they've understood much more than we gave them credit for, but we haven't supported them because we didn't think that they understood that. So remembering, holding that in mind about what the child does understand and what they don't understand. And for me, it's something about thinking about a back translation. When we have a resource translated into another language, which we've been doing with in our UK Trauma Council resources, when we have them, we have to have them translated into Welsh, and then we have someone to translate them back, and we check that that translation back is accurate to the original text. This really made sense for me when I was supporting a preschool that contacted me and said, oh, Beck, can you help us with this one? We've got a child and we know mum has cancer, and the child has come in and said that mummy's got a badger in her tummy. And to be honest, I was quite thrown by this. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I've never heard of cancer described as a badger. What must this mean? How do I make sense of this? And it was later speaking, I said, can I just think about it? Could you check with dad or grandma when he comes to collect the child? Can you check what they've said so we can find out what this means? And it was my colleague who said, do you think they mean badger? Do you think that the adults meant bad germ, but the child heard badger? And actually this child was holding on to an idea that mummy had a badger in her tummy, and actually we needed to revisit that and help them understand that it was a bad germ. I'm just going to leave this quote here for you to read, but the importance of acknowledgement, that if we don't mention to young children that we know what's happened to you and we're really sorry to hear it and we're really sad to hear it, then it's like this big thing happened and nobody's going to mention it. I'm just going to go to my childminder every day and nobody's going to mention that my mummy died, or I'm going to go to my nursery and nobody's going to mention that my brother's died. But so actually our role in acknowledgement is a really important way of showing that we value that experience. So I'm just going to give you a whistle stop through some of the things that might help with children about feelings. We've already talked about the first one, understanding the story. The second one is feeling those feelings. Can we help children to express, to name, and to feel those feelings? Can we help them to adjust to life without the person? And can we help them to hold on to their memories? Really, with this feeling the feelings, it's about, what are my feelings? Do I even know a big enough word? Because I'm pretty be sure that sad isn't big enough. Sad's okay when your ice cream falls off your cornet, and sad's okay when your best friend can't come to tea because Boris Johnson said there's a lockdown and we can't. But sad for the death of someone, it doesn't quite seem big enough, but it's possibly one of the only words a child knows. Where do I feel them? Am I feeling it in my body? And when do I feel it? Do I feel it much more at bedtime? Do I feel it much more when I'm being dropped off at nursery and all of a sudden the world feels a bit scary and big? How big are those feelings? Can you use these feeling spots I've got there? Can the child tell me whether it's a teeny weeny feeling today or a really big one? And how can I express them? This metaphor of puddles can be really helpful for us to think about children's feelings. We know that they're not dissimilar to adults. If we were to complete a wall of different feelings, actually the list for adults and children wouldn't be very different. But for young children, they might not understand their emotions, they might not have the language to express them or the skills to manage them. And we think about puddles, we think about young children dipping in and out of the puddle, doing a little bit of their grief and then saying, oh great, is it sand play now? Can I go and do that? And for us, we might think, I don't know, has this child understood what's happened? Why are they able to just switch off? But actually, it's a really good coping mechanism to be able to go and still join in with parts of their life. And it's a really good indicator for us of how well children are doing. Then we think about adjusting to the life without the person who died. So we're really thinking about looking for opportunities to help the child feel safe. Keeping routines where possible. Lots of children, families have lots of subsequent changes after a death. But if we can keep anything that feels the same, that will be like a safe foundation for children when they're having to cope with other changes. And then being patient. I've got the picture of the mobile there because in a family, it's sometimes described that somebody from that mobile has been taken and that whole mobile would go out of kilter, it would all go off balance. And for any family that are grieving, they're trying to readjust and make their new mobile work. And it won't ever look the same or feel the same, but it can be okay. But that's going to be over a period of time. And then we'll think about memories, keeping memories alive. We might want to use a memory box. We might want to use some photos to help with that. And we might want to look for opportunities to mention, oh, that was mummy's favourite colour too. I love that you've put that on there. And we'll really need to work alongside the family when we're doing this and encourage them to tell stories and keep those memories alive for them. And just have a little think just before I wind up about when we're still worried. Really important to communicate with the family to work out, is what we're seeing in the setting or in our childminding placement, is that the same as what the family is seeing at home? And then start to monitor for those difficulties and work out whether they are impacting on everyday life. And rather than the child being able to dip in and out of the puddle in quite a healthy way, they're being a little bit more stuck. This might indicate traumatic bereavement or something more complicated, and that might be where you want to consider more specialist help. And just a quick next steps for you. I know you've got the fantastic Anna Freud early years resource available to you. There's a couple of other bits. There's a document called Small Steps, which is something I wrote a long time ago for my when I worked for a local authority, and that is, you can still download that, and that's got lots of information for early years providers on specific things I might want to do. Have a look to find out what your local child bereavement service is, and you've got the link to that one there. And because you might find that they offer support for younger children, not all do, but some services do, or will at least offer you some advice. And then have a look for other ways in which you could gather some resources and access some further training. And then finally, just a little plug for the UK Trauma Council. Have a look for our other resources on childhood trauma and traumatic bereavement. And thank you, Camilla.
Thank you so much, Beck. It was a wonderful talk about such a tough subject. I just wanted to remind everyone to use the Q&A function to submit their questions. I was supposed to tell you that before Beck started. I think it hasn't inhibited your question asking because there's been quite a lot come through, which is fab. But please continue asking, because the plan is that we'll bring all the panel together and ask the questions at the end. And also just to remind everyone, because it's come up a couple of times as a question, that we'll make this video and the slides and the links all available after the session. It usually takes a couple of weeks because we get it transcribed, but it does all get shared and then it's kind of hosted on our YouTube channel. So now I'd like to introduce Claudia de Campos to you, who will be talking about how early years staff can support children in their setting who've been affected by miscarriage or stillbirth. Claudia, do you want to turn your camera on and say hello? Great. So I'll just introduce Claudia. So Claudia is a parent-infant psychotherapist here at the Anna Freud Centre, actually, and the team I work in as well. And she's been working at the centre since 2016. And she's a child and adolescent psychotherapist and an adult psychotherapist by background, lots of qualifications, and has a specialist expertise in baby loss. And she's developed a groundbreaking perinatal loss service in 2013. Actually, she did an extremely impressive documentary on Channel 4 or something like that. Just before I started, I was like, oh, I get to work with these famous therapists. And so that's set up at UCLH with the Women's Health team. So I'm going to hand over to you, Claudia.
Okay. Thank you, Camilla. Thank you. Let me just share my screen. Yeah. So I just want to say that this is quite a difficult subject and something that we don't usually want to talk about, and it's hidden, but it's a very, very important type of loss, and that it's much more common than one imagines. Okay, so let's thinking about the impact of perinatal loss in the family, and more specifically with children in the early years. Hold on. Sorry. Sorry, my computer got stuck. I'll try something else. Okay, so dealing with loss in the perinatal period, there are many different kinds of loss. So miscarriages, we call miscarriages are losses before 24 weeks gestation. There's ectopic pregnancy, termination of pregnancy for medical reasons. There is a fetal reduction, stillbirth, which is any loss of pregnancy over 24 weeks, neonatal death, sudden or unexpected death in infancy, and when a baby is removed because of care proceedings. Okay, I think termination, any of those losses are quite traumatic, and stillbirths, many people kind of, go to have the baby, and between the beginning of labor and the end of the labor, baby has died. So we can't, it's not about a competition of how traumatic, which one is more traumatic, because it depends very much on the individual, but they've been waiting and hoping for a long time, and then there is a loss of what was to be. But I want to talk also about termination of pregnancies for medical reasons, because again, an anomaly can reveal itself at any point in the pregnancy, and sometimes because the brain is developed more or less only at 28 weeks, it takes time to be seen in the next scan. So sometimes a couple needs to decide to terminate a pregnancy because of severe anomaly, as much as 34 weeks gestation. There are multiple pregnancies. So in multiple pregnancies, there are usually much more risk than singleton pregnancies. In twin pregnancies, they can develop something called that's twin-to-twin transfusion, where they share a blood supply. This can lead to one or both twins dying. Okay, so often, if this is developed, they have to perform a laser surgery, and then in good cases, both twins go on living, but in other cases, one or both twins might die. More often than not, one. And I just want to say this is very common. At the moment in my caseload, I have about 4 of this family. Okay, where one of the twins died and the other one, it's still kind of has survived. One of the twins can be kind of healthy and the other one may have a fetal anomaly. So that they then decide the termination of one of the twins for medical reasons, because the anomaly would not be conducive with life. And sometimes in cases of quadruplets or bigger multiple pregnancies, because of the risk, depending on the maternal circumstances and the body, how the body is working, some parents might opt to reduce one of the babies. Yeah. So all these are very, very difficult decisions to make. But again, I just want to help you to imagine that a lot of the children that comes into the nursery, they might have, we don't know the background and their early history. So they might be one of these children, or the parents may be experiencing some of those events, life events. Okay, so all this, it's adding, to this I will add that in many cases, the couple's journey trying to conceive may have been very difficult, they may have had multiple cycles of IVF. They may be a single parent who have already taken the risk to go on through pregnancy on their own, because to be a parent is important for them, and then the journey of pregnancy becomes jaundiced, and a pregnancy is lost. And same-sex couples, that there is a lot of thinking and complicated process for that to happen. So I think it's important for us to think about that the impact of such losses, well, impact of any loss, but particularly those losses, they impact the mother's body and mind in a very profound way. Yeah, the impact on the father, the impact on the couple relationship, the impact on the next pregnancy, as the next pregnancy usually will be a much more anxious one. Yeah, because they've learned the worst, they've been through the worst history. So they don't know what the next pregnancy will be. Will it be safe? Will there be a baby in the end of it? The impact on a sibling, often, if it is a case of a first child, they are looking forward to have a sibling or have ambivalent feelings about a new baby coming along, but the relationship will be there in the child's mind, and depending on where in the pregnancy the mother is, they will be looking and counting down for the bump to end in the baby and for them to meet the baby. So that can be very confusing for the sibling, what had happened, and there is no baby coming back home. The impact of grandparents. Yeah, it's a much joyous time to have a newborn in the family. It brings a lot of hope. And usually every parent, no matter what age, wants to stop the suffering of their children. So for grandparents, not only they lost their grandchild, but they also find hard that they can't take the pain away. It impacts on the relationship with the wider family and friends. They might feel disappointed with friends' responses. They might feel jealous. They might ask, why me? Yeah. So it's yeah. So what is different about this kind of loss? Well, one of the most important things is it's because it's invisible. It is a loss of hope, and it is what it was going to be or to become. Yeah, I worked with a couple, and I remember the father saying, well, the mother was describing that although she didn't meet her daughter, she had a relationship with her daughter, and she spent a lot of time with her daughter and talking to her daughter, getting to know her daughter in the belly, you know, the kicks and so on. And then I asked the father, what was it like for you? And then he said, I don't know, I was waiting. So that shows the bewilderment that the whole family feels. Oops, sorry. And it's the loss of the baby that they were waiting to meet. Yeah? So this is very important. Through the whole pregnancy, there are much fantasies, or from conception, you know, what is this baby going to be like? Is it going to be a boy or a girl? Is it going to look like mommy, like daddy? What it's going to be? Often with the siblings, the parents are thinking together, do you want it to be a baby sister or a baby brother? Have you got a name? Which name would you like to name it? And so on. So there was quite a lot going on. A lot to look forward to. And it's a big disappointment. I think the complication also with this kind of loss is because the baby's house is the mother's body. Yeah. And that can lead to a huge feeling of responsibility on the mother's side. It can lead to a lot of feelings of guilt, feelings of shame, as if something is wrong with them. They wonder, is this something that I've done wrong? You know, did I eat too much? Was I working too much? Did I do the wrong thing? Some people feel, is this a punishment for something? There is feelings that their body had failed them, and feelings that they let their partner and their family down. Yeah, so it's quite a complicated, usually a miscarriage, a less so if it is just a few miscarriages or one, but often it can lead to quite a complicated and traumatic grief. So body and mind are usually taken with these feelings, particularly to begin with. With all this in mind, one can imagine how difficult it must be for the parent to have room in their mind to talk to the sibling or to their first or second child. Parents may feel overwhelmed. They may want to protect their child from their own pain. They might find difficult to talk about, and they may not know how to. I think just calling back into Becky's presentation, Becky talked about the early years practitioners to be the translator, or sometimes they have to hold the knowledge until they can pick up what is going on or address, because often the parents might have told the nursery staff, but they don't feel ready to tell their child. So that is quite an important thing. But the child is already picking up that something is not quite right. Yeah, mom is not the same. She looks different, she feels different. Children can feel and they know in their body that something is not right. They'll be feeling that something is up to with mommy, but they may not know what it is. They may become very worried and preoccupied themselves. Children don't know what is going on, or they feel that something is not quite right. They may fill the gaps with their fantasies. Yeah, they may not have a way to communicate their worries. They often might not have their language. And they may become withdrawn, clingy, aggressive. Their play may become quite repetitive. So it's important that if you notice this, that you talk to the parents or find a way to have some space to think together about whatever is going on for them. So communication is key. Some parents might have let you know that their baby has died and that they lost their pregnancy. They may ask you to keep an eye on their child. Other parents may feel too distressed to talk or to communicate. On these occasions, it's important to try to find a way to reach out to the parent and perhaps show your observations of the child and ask them if anything has happened to them or that could be impacting on their child. In either case, it's important that you try to think together with them about how best to help their child. You need to be sensitive that each family has got their own culture. The way you choose to help the child and the family needs to take their culture very much into consideration. Your help needs to follow the same lines as the parents' beliefs. Otherwise, this will be very confusing for the child. So it's better to be simple and factual and help to tell a story. Yeah, so the story needs to be according to the child's age, the family culture, religion, if they have one, and the whole belief system. Don't be afraid of saying the word death or died. And going back to Beck's presentation, the insect, most children have seen a dead insect and then they know what it is. But actually, to say the word may bring relief. At least they know what's going on. It's better not to say loss or fell asleep. I worked with some parents that the grandparents had told mommy lost her baby and that's why she's in hospital. And then the 3-year-old had nightmares and couldn't sleep because she was very worried, where has mommy left the baby? Yeah, so only when we thought about this together, we could address the fear in the 3-year-old and then help her to digest the death of the sibling to come. It's important to notice how the child is taking in and responding to what you are saying. Is the child interested? Is the child becoming fidgeted or distanced? It's important to follow the child's cues. So if they are interested and want to know more, go on and say more. But sometimes they need another conversation at a different point. You might want to suggest to parents that they can create a book together to explain what happened to the child. You might want to help by reading a book that addresses the subject of death. There are loads of children's books talking about that. If the child wants to, they could create a drawing for the baby. And I often suggest to parents that, you know, even if the child don't go to the funeral, they might want to do a drawing to go with the baby. Children go on processing things over time. They might come back another day and ask questions. You don't always have to have the answer. You can always say, that's a good question, an important question. I have to think some more about this one. Children, particularly young children, may have mixed feelings about a baby or baby brother or baby sister joining the family. They may believe that their bad thoughts have caused the baby to die. Yeah, it's what we call magical thinking. It's important to say that it is not their fault or anyone's fault, anybody's fault. Some families would rather not to say the word death, or they may not disclose to you what had happened, but you may sense that something is wrong. In these ways, there are some books that addresses separation that can be helpful, as they will address the subject without being explicit about it. I mean, one of the books that I think it's quite good about in relation to that it addresses the subject without being explicit is this book, No Matter What. Yeah, it is by Debbie Gliori. And yeah. And I'd like to just end to say that we are very resilient beings, and that healthy emotional development is dependent on being able to understand oneself and being understood. So I hope this presentation has given you some pointers that will enable you to help the children in your setting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Thank you. I'm going to invite Beck to turn her microphone back on and join us. And we'll try and answer some of your questions. I felt inspired by your quote that you shared, Claudia, around that we can always answer. That's a very good question, and I'll come back and answer it later.
Yeah.
Sure, I have to answer.
Yeah, I'm just going to try to stop sharing. My mouse has disappeared, so.
Okay. Okay, so thank you everybody for all your questions. I've tried to organise them as best I can around themes with my colleague Hida. So they might not be exactly how you've written them, and it might feel like, you know, we're not going to have time to get through them all. So we'll do our best. So one of the questions was around how you get the balance right between talking about things and not saying too much, and then kind of traumatizing a child in some way. Do either of you have any advice about getting the balance right on that?
I was going to kind of use Claudia's idea about tuning in with the child and you reading their cues. That it's important that we open the door for conversation and communication, but then let's follow the child's cues rather than insist we're going to keep taking you back to what's happened. That would be my thoughts, but I don't know whether Claudia would add anything.
Yeah, I agree. I think if a child is approaching you and saying, you know, this happened, my baby brother died, and then you show interest. Has it? Do you know what happened? What did mommy tell you? And then you can start from that, because they say, well, they went to the hospital, you know, you just can go slowly, you know, and then you can ask, and how do you feel? I mean, what is that for you? What is that like for you? It's a bit sad, you know, and it is sad, you know, it's okay to be sad. Yeah.
So really taking the cues of the child around whether they're feeling comfortable to explore, or that perhaps it's something that you might want to revisit at a later time.
Yeah.
And somebody specifically asked, and I know you kind of touched on this briefly, Beck, around suicide, and what words we might give to talk about that and the distress that goes with it.
We could probably fill the rest of tonight, and we could still be online at 9 o'clock talking about that. It's such a deeply complex issue. In my experience, being truthful with children at an appropriate level for their development is really helpful. So moving them from understanding that the person has died and where they died, and then starting to think about that they made themselves die. When children then ask us a question, well, how? Then we know that they're thinking about that, and it's important that we give them an answer. If they're not yet asking how, then I probably pace myself and read, kind of position myself and tune in with what they're asking. But even very young children may well have overheard something. This is very much one of those occasions when we don't assume they do understand, but equally don't assume that they don't. They may have overheard things. And for young children to find out later that something so significant wasn't shared with them can be really hard. There's a fantastic resource by Winston's Wish that I'd recommend if you're in that situation. You look at that. Really talks us through how, as professionals, we would support parents. Well, this would be led by parents and carers, but how we might be able to point them to that and support them with that. I'm trying to give a briefer answer rather than take up the whole afternoon.
Thank you. Thinking back to that young child, Claudia, who perhaps was giving you the cues that they didn't want to talk about it, perhaps more withdrawn. How would you respond and support them if they were in your early years setting?
Well, I think if they haven't given me the cue that they want to talk, that anything has happened, but they are just kind of withdrawn and sad, I would want to befriend them first, to really let them know that I noticed that they are not being themselves, and that I'm wondering whether something is up, either at home or with did a little friend, either at school with a little friend or at home, and then see if a conversation can begin. But I think being interested and noticing that you notice, I think that this is very important, and then giving them time. And their time might not be that time, but maybe the next day or after playtime, they might come and sit next to you and strike up a conversation. Yeah,
thank you. Do you have anything you wanted to add, Beck?
No, I think Claudia's captured that really well about using your relationship. And I think the timing question is really really significant, because very often if I'm working with a child, the point when I've come in isn't the point when they want to talk about it. So if I've got the early years practitioner there and the parent there, then 3 days later when they're queuing up at the supermarket, that's when the child wants to talk about it. So it's much more about skilling up the people who already know that child to do that support, because of that very issue about that. Just because this is the time we're ready to have that conversation doesn't necessarily mean it's the time the child's ready to.
Thank you. We've had a question about our reluctance to talk about death in general. You gave that example about the life cycle, Beck. And it made me think about some of the things that you are taught in school. One of the things that my daughter's been taught in her nursery is about hibernation. And so when I was telling her about when my grandma died, she died a very long time ago, but I was showing her a piece of jewelry and she said, oh, has she gone to sleep for the winter? And I thought that how these different concepts get very kind of confused in children's minds. And so we've got a question kind of around that theme, around should we be talking about death more explicitly within the setting to all children, so that the concept of death doesn't come up when they've been affected by a bereavement for the first time. It's a conversation that we're having.
For me, that would be a really helpful foundation, to be able to have honest conversations about living and dying, just as part of when we find a bird in the play area, And rather than go, quick, keep the children inside, let's, oh gosh, that bird's died, that's really sad. Should we do something? Should we signal it? Should we have a little ritual around it? What should we do? Let's put it in a special box. Let's use that. Children come across these things. You know, they're playing Mario and the character dies, but then comes back to life. So this is not an unfamiliar term, but we can be really helpful in building up children's understanding. We hope that they don't have to face the real significant grief of somebody important, but at least we can have done some of that helpful work. And there are fantastic stories out there, just about thinking. I'm sure lots of you have got the Mog books. I'm just looking, I've got a Mog one here. Mog books, Goodbye Mog, which kind of finishes that series when Mog sadly dies. So have those as part of your story time, and then it's not a big, oh, we're going to talk about this and we're waiting till something to happen, but we're helping children to understand. We can't stop death being sad, but we might be able to stop it being scary, and things that we can, where we encourage on open conversation around that, we might be able to minimize that fear.
Thank you.
I agree, Beck, but I'm just thinking that perhaps I wonder how much people around the child feel comfortable with that, isn't it? Whether there is something to be done amongst us all, among society.
Yeah.
In that sense. And I guess the pandemic made us really have to look at that. But how to help us to, that is the cycle of life, isn't it? And there is no way around it.
Yeah, very much so. And I appreciate that different people will come at this from a different starting point, and it might not be so easy, because it's a thing I do all day, every day, and that might feel easier for me. But I totally appreciate that if you're new, have a think about looking at some of the resources that are out there really widely, because that might help build your confidence in talking about a subject that might feel unfamiliar or less comfortable for you.
Yeah, and I was talking to a couple today, actually, that had lost their daughter, was a stillbirth since nearly to 40 weeks gestation, and they have a 3-year-old. And I was talking about the Goodbye Mog book to them, but for the father. Because I think the children's books are really helpful for adults, for us all.
To find words to use.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question specifically about stillbirth here, Claudia. And do you have any advice if perhaps a stillbirth affected the family before the toddler in the early years setting, and that it's that child who died is still very alive in the family and in the minds of the parents, and helping them, the child in the setting who's been born afterwards, make sense of it?
I think again, it's how to find out what have the parents said to the child, because I think it's really important to go along with that, because you don't want to get into a conflict with the story that they were told. You know, I think that that's one of the most important things. And perhaps to help the child to say yes, that there was somebody that was to come, you know, but it couldn't be here. But mommy still loves him or her, and so just like mommy loves you, but you are here, she can see you every day. But that one, it's wherever the story that the parents said. I mean, I think and I think there are few books at Sun's website, and one of them was, my mother was going to have a baby and she has an angel instead. Yeah, so some parents say it became an angel, or it became a star, or yes, so there is an idea that it's still around. But I think the book, The Invisible Strings, it's not about death necessarily, but it's about connection and constancy. Yeah, so it's not because somebody is not here that that they cease to exist in one's mind. Yeah, that love is still there. I think sometimes children might feel that mommy loved the other one better. And that can become a bit more of a complication. And then specialist help might be sought.
Thank you. There have been quite a few questions around some young children displaying their kind of response to death through kind of maybe more behavioural difficulties or anger in the setting, and some, whether either of you have any advice around how to manage that in, you know, both you know, kind of trying to encourage you know, and support that child through what they're going through, whilst also kind of managing the setting and the behaviour. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I guess my first thought, I think, is when something like this happens to adults, it's hard to manage our emotions, isn't it? So why would, you know, absolutely a 2, 3, 4-year-old is going to have just the same difficulties in managing emotions, but maybe express them in different ways. I probably want to start with checking in with the family to see whether the things we're seeing in a setting match the things that are being seen at home, whether there are different stresses. Are there nightmares and bedwetting and a regression in delay, so we can start to build a whole picture. It's sometimes really difficult to say what we would do to address that single behaviour until we understand a little bit more about what's going on. And then I guess I would want to find out, what do they know and understand, and is it because they're very frightened and we can help them understand, and does that help reduce some of these behaviours, because it might be a response to real confusion and real stress. They'd be my first thoughts. There might be some other thoughts about specific behaviours, but Claudia, you've probably got some, may have some thoughts on that as well.
I was thinking alongside you, but also I think if there is a way to be able to express, I think sometimes the anger is because there is something. I mean, they might feel very clearly angry because, you know, my dad is not here anymore, you know, so that is very straightforward and easier to manage, isn't it? Then when the behavior is showing a frustration about something that they can't quite communicate or pinpoint. And I imagine is the difficulty in processing whatever happened. So I guess it's, you know, you gave the quote about acknowledgement and acknowledging, yeah, and that life has changed and it's tough.
Yeah. Sometimes, can I just add a little bit to that? I'm just thinking about some of the things that might be things, of course, when I don't know a specific child, it's hard to, but things that might be helpful are to do some of that lovely acknowledgement that Claudia was saying. And they're saying, you've got some cross feelings, where should we put them? Should we play with some water balloons out in the outdoor area? Should we get some big newspaper and scrunch up and roll it up? Can you tell me what's made that feeling feel so cross today? So we just encourage the crossness to be a little bit more playful where we can, but recognise that this is a child with overwhelming emotions right now, and they need us to come alongside them rather than and look at that behaviour in the context of what's happening.
Yeah.
I know that can be really challenging when you've got a child maybe who's struggling to interact with their peers, but think about what they can do with those feelings.
I think that is really helpful, isn't it? Because just sometimes to say, it's okay to be cross. I get it. Does it? No?
No, I think that's right. There's been another question around, because, you know, particularly in the last year, but because death affects so many of us in many different ways. Do you have any advice or thoughts on how early years staff who have been affected by death themselves support themselves with children in their care who have also gone through a bereavement, and it's quite distressing and triggering for them.
Claudia, it's always hard to know whether I'm just keep jumping in with thoughts, so please feel free to put yourself forward. I guess that we use that quote, don't we, about putting your own oxygen mask on first, and that actually your well-being is really vital, and seeking where can you find support for your well-being before you're asked to support another grieving child. And it may be that their grief re-triggers your grief as well. So I'd really urge people who are also grieving, and I'd urge your peers and your colleagues around you to allow you the time and space to do some of your grieving and have some support for that before you're asked to support a grieving child. But you may be in a beautiful position to do so because your empathy and compassion will be there too. But think about where you can get some support for your own well-being.
Yeah, I agree.
There's a question that's come in about an example of a young child whose mum had a miscarriage and then she's pregnant again, and the child's presenting in the setting is quite worried that the baby in mum's tummy might die again. Do you have any thoughts about how the early years worker might be able to talk to the young child about that worry?
Well, I think I would say something like, I get it. It's hard to know because the last baby didn't go on, isn't it? The last baby died. So we don't know about this one, but I think, and mommy wants it to go on living, to get big just like you. Mommy went to special doctors that are helping mommy in that journey. And so we just have to see, but we don't, I wouldn't kind of ruminate too much. We don't know for sure, but we just have to see, but try to build on hope, but we can't give certainties. And that's the reality.
So there's some real themes around the big feelings that children can have, whether they're angry feelings or confused ones and sadness, that the more that we can acknowledge and validate and name them with them to allow them to be, that can serve to be very helpful. Do you have any other thoughts about that example, Beck?
No, I'd kind of go with Claudia's, that acknowledge the difficulty. It's not a worry we can say, oh, don't be worried about that, because it's very real. And the child has had real experience of that, and will probably be picking up on the anxiety of the parents, whether or not they're able to name that openly. So I don't think it's a sitting with the child with their anxiety and acknowledging it, rather than trying to tell them, don't worry about that, because you can't stop your worry when it's about something so real as that.
Thank you. So either of you have any thoughts around working with a child who's experienced a death, who has autism or special educational needs, and perhaps either there's some different examples, but either struggles with expressing big feelings and certainly naming them, but also kind of perhaps struggles to process cognitively some of the complex concepts that we've discussed in relation to death and family. Are there any resources available? Any kind of case examples that you could provide, perhaps?
I think when we're working with children with cognitive difficulties or children on the autistic spectrum, we've got kind of another layer of complication, haven't we, of explaining something which is concrete. The things that I suggested about using bugs, I think, can be really concrete. Sometimes when I've worked with children or supported staff around children with autism, there's been a suggestion that we won't use the word death because they don't know that word. We'll use a word they do know, like finished or gone. And then we've had a look at that and think, actually, how can we explain that granddad has finished and that be meaningful? Because playtime finishes, but then it starts again, lunchtime finishes. So I've really tried to help staff to see that just because that's a term that that child knows, let's not be restricted by that, because we need to introduce a new term. We wouldn't, for example, help a child know cat, dog, and then say when a sheep comes along, well, let's just call it dog. You know, and I know this is different, but this is about, we have to take a new piece of language, and we need to think about the ways in which we support children to manage any change. So if we're supporting a child with transition to school, well, we use a lot more visual things, lots small steps, breaking it down and repeating it. And I'd be thinking about the people that already know that child best and we're already great at translating the world for them. Think about those same things that you use and seeing whether you can support the child with that. But being very mindful that it's even an even more complicated journey to make sense of those things.
I completely agree with you, Bex, and I think the way you were explaining just reminded when I actually worked in an autism team long time ago, and I remember kind of we discussing and thinking that sometimes with autistic children, the whole family becomes autistic. Yeah, because we restrict our families tend to restrict themselves to what the child know and it's safe. But that doesn't help anybody to expand and actually minimize the capacity. So I think what you were saying, kind of, you know, don't go to what it's known only, isn't it? Try to introduce new things in a small way, homeopathic doses. It will help them to expand and go on developing because they still have got their emotional world that needs attending.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it kind of reminds me, I'm thinking of a little boy with autism who when you just think, I've got it, they understand now that daddy can't come back. And then mum tells you that every time the phone's gone at home, the child said, daddy, daddy. And you've realized it's so difficult to transfer that knowledge, that they understand it in relation to that. But then we've got to explain that when the phone goes, it can't be daddy, that he hasn't died. So there's often a lot more revisiting to make sure that that child, and really tuning into what are the things they're saying and what are the things they're doing. How are they now making sense of the world because of this thing that's happened?
But I think just to get on, of course, it's more clear with the autistic child because it's so much more concrete. But I think everybody who has suffered a bereavement or an important bereavement knows that we have times that we think it hasn't happened. You know, so and so is going to walk in at any point, isn't it? So it's also how to contextualize.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. With such varied questions. Could I invite you both to just finish with a kind of parting thought that you would want people to kind of go away with today?
My thought, I think sometimes we feel that as if we're a teacher or an early years practitioner or a childminder, that this is the work for counsellors and therapists and things. But actually, in my experience, most children are best supported by caring human beings, no matter what the letters are on your name or what your job title. And you being a caring human being who is already good at engaging with children is just what the vast majority of children need. So if I can give you the confidence, and with that.
Yeah. And for me, it's okay not to know. The important thing is to notice and to be interested. We don't have to fix anything.
Thank you both so much. A huge thanks to our speakers and to the kind of support team, our interpreters, and to all of you for coming. I just want to do a final couple of reminders, which is please can people complete our feedback form. So helpful for us when we run these events. We really use them to try and improve things. And I look forward to seeing some of you again at our next webinar on working with trauma and abuse, which is on the 24th of June. So thanks again, everyone, and bye for now.